Binding on Her Majesty. This act is binding on Her Majesty in right of Canada or a province. Liability of the minister. Guarantee by the minister. Subject to this act and the regulations, the minister is liable. Farm Medic Act. Her Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate and House of Commons of Canada, enacts as follows. So you see, it's Her Majesty, that's who they're claiming, who is enacting the law, on the advice of the Senate and the House of Commons, on the advice of the ministers. But it's Her Majesty that takes action. So when you begin to look into the acts and regulations, the statutes, you're going to see that a lot of times, most everywhere in these acts and regulations, it states that this act that you're reading, it binds Her Majesty. It binds her up. And if it doesn't say that directly, it's going to say that the minister or the one who's in charge of this department, this act binds that minister and the acts and the duties that he's to perform. So there's a legal obligation that's being presented there. Now, you find that all over the law, these obligations. Black Laws, 2nd edition, bind, to obligate, to bring or place under definite duties or legal obligations, particularly by a bond or covenant. Look at that word, covenant. To affect one in a constraining or compulsory manner with a contract or a judgment, so long as a contract, an adjudication, or a legal relation remains in force and virtue and continues to impose duties or obligations, it is said to be binding. A man is bound by his contract or promise. Black Law, 7th edition, binding, of an agreement that binds a binding contract, of an order that requires obedience. The temporary injunction was binding on the parties. The acts say that these acts, they are binding on Her Majesty. They call her Her Majesty the Queen of Canada. And they say that we are her subjects, her citizens. And then they use these laws against us to try and control us or cause us financial damage. But in those laws, when you start to look at them not from the point of view of a legal person, but from the point of view as a man or woman, then you're going to see that they are also obligated to you. Because there's another role that you can fulfill. And that role offers you more freedoms and more rights than what you have been entitled to up till now in life. Here in Canada, we have ministers, and we have government departments, and we have agents that work in these departments. Now, all three of these, they all work for the Crown, in law, for the Crown. And the Crown works for Her Majesty. Now, we know that Her Majesty is an incorporated fiction being who's not really alive anymore. For when they incorporated Canada, the one who was Her Majesty at the time is dead already. It's not a living being. It's just a symbology. However, the hierarchy, the power structure, does reside within the monarchy. And the symbol or the figurehead of the monarchy is indeed the Queen. And they call her Her Majesty, the Queen of Canada. Now, through her representatives, the ministers, the departments, and the agents, she's under obligation. They're under obligation to fulfill your human rights. Those rights that you have been learning about here on YouTube, and hopefully on my channel, and let me encourage you, hopefully on the DVD series, and they're supposed to be filling those. They are under obligation by law to be fulfilling your human rights. However, what they do is they strip you of your human rights. By considering you a legal person in law, the obligations that they have to fulfill your rights, they remove from you. And then they return to you certain rights and freedoms. And those certain rights and freedoms are watched over by the ministers, the departments, and the agents. And they all act in a position of authority over you because they act with you as a legal person. However, you still are a man and a woman, regardless of what they are doing to you, and you still have all your rights and all your freedoms available to you. And in the acts it says that these acts and these laws, they bind Her Majesty. They bind her up, having to follow them. And if they bind her up, then they bind the crown up. And if they bind the crown up, then they bind the crown's servants up. And specifically when you look in black laws, you saw that they used that word when they spoke about binding and contracts and obligations. They said the word covenant. And now when you look to the social, economic, and cultural rights, they call this a covenant. And Canada has signed upon it. So that covenant, Canada, through Her Majesty, is obligated to fulfill it. But they don't. So you can go against them and say, hey, listen here, there's obligations, and your servants are failing. That's why I'm coming to you now and seeking relief in Crown. There are rights and freedoms that are available to you, the man and woman. There are human rights that are available here in Canada. And the Crown and the ministers, they have a legal obligation. Not just because you say, well, oh, I believe there's a right and I want to express that because it's something I believe. No, these are rights that they've signed to that have produced a legal obligation upon Canada and a legal obligation upon the Queen or upon Her Majesty and her representatives, to you personally and to me personally. The legal obligation. And they have to fulfill those rights and freedoms because they are bound to fulfill them. Now some people will say, oh, I can't have that happen and that's not going to work and this and this and that. Well, I'll return this back to you and say you're just being a naysayer because you've never went after your human rights here in Canada. You've never even known how to do it. Before I've come here on YouTube and helped you to understand what's going on. And I'm not saying that in an issue of pride, but I'm saying don't be a naysayer. Listen up and understand that these ministers who are supposed to fulfill your rights and are supposed to fulfill the obligations of these covenants are not doing so. They're stripping you of your rights and you're none the wiser. Now when you become the wiser, you can go and say, hey, there's a problem here. Canada, Her Majesty, all your representatives, the Crown, you're all under obligation to me personally. I don't care about McDonald's, I don't care about the banks, I don't care about anybody, but to me personally, I have intrinsic human rights that were granted to me, that you signed upon the covenants and said I could have them here in Canada. You've removed those rights from me, and you've given me limited rights and freedoms. Now I'm here to claim what is naturally and physically mine. That's why when you start to process all this and you start understanding what's going on here in Canada, and you begin to say, oh, I desire to go after my intrinsic rights now because I realize what's happened and I realize why I've been held in bondage, why I've been controlled, why I've been suffering. Because if I could have had my intrinsic rights fulfilled from a young child up until now, then it would have been a different situation in all of our lives. But nevertheless, when you realize what's going on, you begin to want to seek relief from all this. You'll realize it's Her Majesty directly that you're going through. In the Crown Liabilities and Proceedings Act, when you start your process, when you start your proceeding, your motion, it's Her Majesty that is mentioned. No other statement of claim will be accepted, because what you're doing is going after Her Majesty for not fulfilling those covenants that have granted you those rights. And you must go against Her Majesty. And she is the figurehead here in Canada. We know that the ministers, the departments, the government, they're in operation, and they're the ones who are actually taking care of business, but in law, in the structure of it, she's the figurehead. That's why she's on our money. That's why her pictures are all over the Parliament buildings. That's why Canadians actually, some of them worship her, because they think that she is the Queen of Canada. But when you go after your relief, you're going to realize that your motion is to Her Majesty. And you're seeking relief that her agents, her ministers, these departments, such as welfare and medical aid and the hospitals and all of these systems, unemployment insurance and CSST insurance and worker compensation insurance, that they're not providing for your human needs, your human rights, your intrinsic rights. They're giving you limited resources, limited funds, while the government is spending in an abundance, more than an abundance. They're stripping you of your rights through these systems. So you go and you say, it's time now for me to have relief. It's time now for me not to be in poverty anymore. It's time now for me not have security in my life. Because this is part of what life is granted. If any of us think about it, life wasn't meant to be full of trials and tribulations and burdens. They're only this way because we're constantly operating in a commercial system that is constantly making demands upon us. Because none of us knew that there's any other way. None of us understand that there's another way to be in existence here in life. And then when we begin to understand, it's hard to accept. Because how we've been taught obligations is different than what the law teaches obligations. The government is quick to say that you're obligated to pay tax, you're obligated to pay insurance, you're obligated to pay this and that. Yet when you want to flip the cards around and say, well, hey, don't you have some obligations here too? Towards me, the human, towards me, the man and the woman? Because I read here in the laws that you signed and that they became legal, that you're obligated to fulfill such and such right for me. And those rights, I hope you've learned them here at YouTube. Hope you've watched these videos. And again, I'll say it, I hope you were encouraged enough to go and pick up those home DVD series, so now you have all that information for yourself. So you can sit back and study, and when it's time you can get up and go on your own and seek your relief against Her Majesty and those ministers and the departments. Not saying the men and the women behind those departments, not judging you or saying anything bad about you. I'm saying the whole system. It's not functioning the way it needs to be, and it's stripped all of us of our rights. And it's clearly in the law that we are allowed to go and to declare that we need relief from all of this. And in seeking that relief, then Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 11 of the Covenant of Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights. And we can keep on going on. Food, clothing, housing, shelter, continuous improvement of your living condition. Those are the rights that you are granted. And those are the rights that you can seek after. Hope you enjoyed this video. This is the Civil Code 1372. It's just to show you about what an obligation is. An obligation arises from a contract or from any act or fact to which the effects of an obligation are attached by law. So obligations arise from law and they are attached by law.